All right, welcome back. Today, we are talking about an issue that can affect a lot of people silently, and it's one of the things that can happen alongside other issues and not be found, at least for quite some time. And so, therefore, it's a reason that symptoms can persist. So, if you are dealing with urgent, watery diarrhea after meals, you might feel like almost anything can set it off. Maybe you've tried eliminating foods that you thought were triggering the problem, like dairy or gluten or FODMAPs or anything else that seems suspicious, could be something random, only to find that the diarrhea continued even while you kept cutting out foods. So when somebody tells me that they're following a strict low FODMAP diet and they're still having frequent urgent diarrhea with very little improvement from that change, that really gets my attention, and it makes me question whether FODMAPs are really the primary problem and start to consider whether bile acid diarrhea could be part of the picture. So, with bile acid diarrhea, the problem is not necessarily one specific food. It may instead be the amount of fat in a meal and how your body is handling the bile acids released to digest that fat. When excess bile acids reach the colon, they can pull in water, which causes loose stools and urgency, and that need to go exactly where the nearest bathroom is. Fortunately, this does not mean you need to eliminate fat or live on a bland food forever, because once you understand what's going on, the dietary approach is usually much more manageable. We're looking at how much fat your digestive system can handle at one time, how to distribute it throughout the day, and how something like paying attention to soluble fiber can help. So, with this, you learn to manage your diet, not become a prisoner to it. So, in today's episode, I'm going to explain what bile acid diarrhea is, why fat can make it worse, which foods tend to work well with it, and how to make practical adjustments based on your own personal tolerance. And if you want some help putting all of this into practice, I have created a free bile acid diarrhea diet guide with a complete food list, practical meal ideas, a 7-day meal plan, and a 7-day grocery list for that meal plan. So you will find the link to that in the show notes. Now let's start by just defining what is bile acid diarrhea. So bile acid diarrhea happens when more bile acids than usual reach the colon or the large intestine. And once they get there, they stimulate the colon to release water, which moves its contents through more quickly. And that's where you see the frequent watery diarrhea, which can come on often with very little warning. So, to understand why this happens, it helps to know what bile acids are supposed to do in the first place. So, your liver makes bile, and your gallbladder stores bile and concentrates it between meals. So, when you eat, especially when you eat fat, the gallbladder releases bile into the small intestine. And those bile acids help to break the fat down so your body can absorb it. They're like detergent. They break the fat and oils down so that your body can absorb it along with fat soluble vitamins like A, D, E, and K. Bile acids are not bad. You need them. The problem is simply that you need them in the right place. Once bile acids have done their job in the small intestine, your body's designed to recycle them. About 95% of bile acids are normally reabsorbed, usually in the last part of the small intestine, and carried back to the liver to be used again. But if too many bile acids escape that recycling process and spill into the colon, does not particularly appreciate it. And those bile acids stimulate the release of water and electrolytes, which irritates the colon, and it triggers stronger contractions that push stool through faster. So now you have more fluid entering the colon and less time to reabsorb it. And that combination really helps explain why diarrhea can be so watery and so urgent and so difficult to control. You might also hear this referred to as bile acid malabsorption, or BAM, and the terms are often used interchangeably, but they don't mean exactly the same thing. Bile acid malabsorption describes what happens when the small intestine does not reabsorb those bile acids properly. And that can occur when the last part of the small intestine, which is called the terminal ileum, has been damaged or inflamed or even surgically removed. But some people are reabsorbing bile acids normally, but they're simply producing more than their small intestine can reclaim. So in that situation, malabsorption doesn't fully describe the problem. And so you can have bile acid diarrhea or BAD. Great acronym, right? And that's broader and often a more accurate term because it includes both possibilities. Because, especially initially, we might not know what the actual problem is, why it's happening, why those bile acids are ending up in the stool in excess. So the symptoms of this can look a little different from one person to the next, but here are the things I commonly listen for. Watery or very loose stools, which may sometimes appear yellow, diarrhea that comes on soon after eating, a sudden intense need to go to the bathroom, frequent bowel movements, abdominal cramping, waking during the night to have diarrhea, and then difficulty holding a bowel movement or having occasional accidents. Then there's the part that does not always make it onto the symptom list, and that's the way it really begins to affect your life. So let me tell you about Carrie. Carrie's diarrhea started not long after she had her gallbladder removed, and at the time, no one connected those two events. So she was eventually told that she had IBS-D. So she did what many people do when they're desperate to figure out which food is causing the problem. She started removing foods. First, she removed dairy, then she removed gluten, then she removed onions and garlics, and eventually she was following a very limited low FODMAP diet. But she was still having urgent watery diarrhea. And she learned that she could get through the morning appointment if she skipped breakfast. Before a road trip, she would just not eat because she didn't want to have any problems. And if a friend invited her to lunch, she would look at the menu beforehand, check how far the restaurant was from home, and start thinking about where the bathrooms were before she even decided whether she wanted to go. And restaurant meals were the biggest gamble for her. So she might feel completely fine while she was eating, but then 20 to 30 minutes later, need to find a bathroom immediately. And this is a kind of pattern I pay very close attention to when I'm working with clients. Carrie's history did not automatically prove that she had bile acid diarrhea, but urgent watery diarrhea that began after gallbladder removal and was especially likely after richer meals was an important clue. So it deserved more investigation than just simply assuming she had another food intolerance. And bile acid diarrhea is frequently mistaken for just IBS-D or diarrhea predominant irritable bowel syndrome because the symptoms do overlap so much. So listen to this. Research suggests that bile acid malabsorption may be present in more than a quarter of people who meet the diagnostic criteria for IBS-D. You heard me correctly. This could be going on in up to 25% of cases of IBS-D. And that does not mean that everyone with IBS-D has bile acid diarrhea. And it does not mean that everyone who has their gallbladder removed will develop it. So hear that as well. But gallbladder removal is a recognized risk factor, and persistent watery urgent diarrhea should not automatically be blamed on dairy, gluten, FODMAPs, or whatever food happened to be on the plate that day. Sometimes the most important clue is not one particular food, it's the timing, the type of meal, the person's medical history, and the pattern that emerges when we finally put all of those pieces together. So, why does fat make bile acid diarrhea worse, and how much should you eat? Because fat can make bile acid diarrhea worse because eating fat signals your digestive system to release bile. And if your body is not reabsorbing bile acids efficiently, or if it is producing more than it can recycle, a higher fat meal can mean more bile acids reaching the colon. There's no single amount of fat that works for everyone. So the goal is to find the amount of fat that you can comfortably tolerate, not to remove all of the fat from your diet altogether. And this is where the relationship between food and symptoms can become confusing because you might eat a meal containing chicken, potatoes, and vegetables one day and feel fine. Then eat what looks like a similar meal at a restaurant and have urgent diarrhea before you even make it home. The difference is not the chicken and it's not the potatoes. It may be the butter used on the vegetables or the oil added during cooking or the creamy sauce or the dressing you barely noticed. Restaurant meals can contain much more fat than the same foods prepared at home, even when nothing on the plate looks particularly greasy. I mean, think about restaurant mashed potatoes. They taste much richer than the version you would make at home because the restaurant's probably using way more butter or cream than you ever would. The same goes for vegetables that arrive glistening with oil or a piece of fish that's been finished with butter. The meal might look simple, but that does not necessarily mean that it's low in fat. And the type of fat is not always the issue because olive oil, avocado, nuts, seeds, and salmon, those are nutritious foods and they're often called healthy fats because metabolically they generally are. Unsaturated fats really support heart health and healthier cholesterol levels, and foods like salmon also provide beneficial omega-3 fatty acids. But your digestive tract still has to process them as fat. They still stimulate bile release, and a large amount at one meal can still worsen bile acid diarrhea. I see people get tripped up by this all the time because they assume that if olive oil is healthy, more must be okay, or maybe even better. So they cook their eggs in oil, they add avocado, they sprinkle on cheese, and maybe have nuts on the side, lots of healthy fats. And none of those foods are inherently a problem, but together they can create a fairly high fat meal. With bile acid diarrhea, the amount of fat in the entire meal may matter more than whether any one food is good or bad. So, how much fat should we aim for? You will sometimes see recommendations to keep fat below 40 grams per day or around 20% of total calories. And that guidance comes from one prospective study of a diet providing 20% of calories from fat. Participants in this study with confirmed bile acid malabsorption experienced improvements in urgency and bowel frequency, bloating and bowel control, and their average intake after the intervention was about 42 grams of fat per day. And that gives us a helpful clinical reference point, but it does not mean that everybody with bile acid diarrhea needs exactly 40 or 42 grams of fat. The research on diet for bile acid diarrhea is still limited, and your needs depend on your own calorie requirements, symptom severity, medical history, nutritional status, and whether you are using medication to bind bile acids. So in our practice, I'm often more interested in the pattern than in immediately handing someone a strict daily number. And I also want to look at, is most of the day's fat concentrated into one meal? Do symptoms happen after restaurant meals, but not after similar meals at home? Does breakfast go well until several sources of fat are combined? Can the person tolerate a small amount of avocado, but not avocado with eggs and cheese and cooking oil all in the same sitting? Those details help us figure out whether the better first step is lowering total fat, spreading it more evenly across the day, or simply reducing the largest portions. For example, someone may tolerate a modest amount of peanut butter on toast in the morning and olive oil with dinner. But if they have peanut butter, full fat yogurt, nuts, avocado, and a generous pour of olive oil with the same meal, the total amount may overwhelm their current tolerance. And this is also why I don't love giving people a list of foods that are either allowed or not allowed, because a food may work perfectly well in one portion and cause symptoms in another. And it may also be tolerated as part of a simple meal, but not when it's stacked with several other sources of fat. You need some fat in your diet to absorb the fat soluble vitamins, vitamin A, D, E, and K, to obtain essential fatty acids, to meet your calorie needs, and to make meals satisfying. An unnecessarily severe low fat diet is not a good thing. It can lead to weight loss, inadequate nutrition, and an increasingly limited relationship with food. So, no, the goal is not to eat as little fat as humanly possible. It is to reduce the amount enough to calm symptoms. Pay attention to how much you are eating at one time, and then adjust based on what your body is actually telling you. And if you're wondering what that looks like as far as a moderate fat approach, our bile acid diarrhea diet guide is linked to in the show notes, and that'll really help you just hit the ground running with better food choices, maybe foods to limit, and that 7-day meal plan with a grocery list. So it's designed to help you put these principles into practice without having to calculate the fat in every bite or live on an impossibly restrictive diet. So, what foods should you eat with bile acid diarrhea? Most people with bile acid diarrhea can eat a wide variety of foods. Meals tend to be better tolerated when they are built around lean protein, grains or other starches, fruits and vegetables, and moderate portions of fat. The goal is not to find a tiny list of completely safe foods, it's to create satisfying meals that give your digestive system a more manageable amount of fat at one time. And a simple place to start is by building meals from 4 basic parts: a lean source of protein, a grain or starchy vegetable, fruit, vegetables, or both, and a modest amount of fat for flavor, nutrition, and satisfaction. And that can look like grilled chicken with rice, cooked zucchini, and a small amount of olive oil, or oatmeal with banana and low fat Greek yogurt, or baked fish with potatoes and green beans. Nothing about those meals is especially unusual, but that's the point. Eating for bile acid diarrhea does not require specialty products or a complicated list of foods that no one else in your household wants to eat. So let's talk about the proteins that are generally easier to tolerate, because lean proteins just make it easier to get enough protein without using up most of your fat tolerance in one part of the meal. Options for this may include skinless chicken or turkey, fish and seafood, lean cuts of beef or pork, egg whites or a combination of whole eggs and egg whites, beans, lentils, tofu, or tempeh if you tolerate them, and low-fat Greek yogurt or cottage cheese or other reduced fat dairy products. And if you're lactose intolerant, stick with those lactose-free versions. This does not mean that you can never eat salmon or whole eggs or higher fat cuts of meat again. It just means that leaner proteins can be easier to work with while symptoms are active because they leave more room for fat elsewhere in the meal. So you're really managing your day. For example, if you choose salmon, which naturally contains more fat, you may want to prepare the vegetables with less oil. Or if you choose a chicken breast, you may have more flexibility to add avocado or dressing compared to maybe if you choose a cut of steak. We're looking at the whole plate, not judging each food in isolation. Let's talk about carbohydrates next. Rice, potatoes, oats, quinoa, pasta, bread, and other grains can all fit into this diet. And these foods provide energy and can make even a moderate fat meal feel substantial and satisfying. And this is important because people often lower fat and accidentally lower calories at the same time. They'll remove cheese, oil, nuts, avocado, creamy sauces, and richer meals, but they do not replace the energy with anything else. So they end up hungry or losing weight or trying to get through the day on grilled chicken and vegetables. So a moderate fat diet still needs to be enough food, and that's where carbohydrate foods come in. But they're not just fillers either. Oats, barley, beans, lentils, and certain fruits and vegetables also provide soluble fiber, which may help improve stool consistency when you have bile acid diarrhea. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to use soluble fiber later, because increasing it too quickly can create an entirely different set of problems. Now let's talk about fruits and vegetables, because fruits and vegetables are absolutely still an important part of the diet. But when diarrhea is especially active, cooked, peeled, canned, or softer options can be easier to tolerate than a very large raw salad or a plate full of coarse fibrous vegetables. So you might want to start with foods like bananas, applesauce, melon, peaches, or canned fruit packed in juice, cooked carrots, zucchini, squash, green beans, or peeled potatoes, soups containing soft vegetables and rice and noodles or lean protein, or oatmeal, baked fruit, or smoothies made without a large amount of added fat. And this does not mean raw produce is bad for bile acid diarrhea or needs to be removed entirely or permanently. It just gives the digestive tract less work to do during a flare. And I often explain this as changing the form of the food before eliminating the food itself. An apple may not sit well, but applesauce might. A large raw broccoli salad may worsen your symptoms, while a smaller portion of well cooked broccoli may be perfectly manageable. And those distinctions can preserve far more variety than automatically placing the entire food on the never eat list. So, what should you eat though when symptoms are really flaring? When your diarrhea is especially active, temporarily simplifying your meals and choosing foods that are lower in fat, softer in texture, and familiar to your digestive system is a good idea. So, things like rice, oatmeal, toast, potatoes, bananas, applesauce, soup, lean poultry, fish, and cooked vegetables are a good foundation, but this doesn't mean skipping meals or surviving on crackers. So you want to try something like oatmeal with a banana for breakfast, a turkey sandwich with applesauce at lunch, and baked chicken with rice and cooked carrots for dinner. And then once your symptoms begin to settle, you can gradually bring back more variety and texture and moderate portions of fat. That was actually a really important shift for Carrie. She had spent years removing so many foods, dairy, gluten, onions, garlic, FODMAPs, because she assumed one of them must be causing the diarrhea. And then once we started paying attention to the fat in the entire meal, she realized that many of those foods were not a problem at all. So she could tolerate regular toast with gluten in it. She could tolerate potatoes. She could even tolerate some dairy. What she struggled with was rich restaurant meals containing butter, oil, cheese, and a creamy sauce all in one meal. And that gave us much more useful direction. So instead of continuing to shrink her diet, we were actually rebuilding meals around foods she already tolerated and adjusted the amount and distribution of the fat. That became our focus versus the individual foods themselves. All right, so what foods should we really limit with this condition? So, foods that are especially high in fat are going to be the most likely to worsen bile acid diarrhea, particularly when several sources of fat are combined in one meal. So, that's going to be, I mean, I almost don't have to tell you, right? Because we all know what fatty foods are. So, the fried foods, the fatty meats, the full fat dairy products, rich sauces, pastries, meals prepared with lots of butter and oil. But limit does not mean never eat again. The amount you eat, the other foods that are on your plate, and how active your symptoms, those all play in. So these are the ones to watch. We'll say watch these guys. Fried chicken, French fries, onion rings, and other deep fried foods. Bacon, sausage, hot dogs, and higher fat cuts of pork or beef. Pizza, burgers, and creamy pasta dishes. Butter, heavy cream, sour cream, and full fat cheese. Creamy soups, gravies, Alfredo sauce, and rich salad dressings. Donuts, croissants, pastries, cookies, and other baked goods made with a significant amount of butter or shortening. Large portions of nuts, nut butter, avocado, coconut milk, especially the canned stuff, or added oils. And then fast food and restaurant meals with multiple sources of fat. So some of these are obvious. You probably already know that a basket of fried food is high in fat. Others are a lot easier to underestimate. So, a salad, for example, may sound like the safest thing on the menu, but when there's cheese in it, avocado, nuts, bacon, a creamy dressing, and chicken fried in oil or cooked in oil, it might contain just as much fat as that burger that you were trying not to order. So, I do see this happen quite a bit with salads and then with smoothies too. Someone can start with fruit, then add full fat yogurt and peanut butter, chia seeds, coconut milk, and maybe half of an avocado. Every one of those ingredients has nutritional benefits, but together they create a very high fat drink that can move through the digestive system quickly. So, again, the issue is not that any one of those foods is bad, it's the cumulative amount. We call it fat stacking. So, what do you mean by fat stacking? Fat stacking is what happens when several moderate or high fat foods are combined in the same meal. Each individual portion may be reasonable, but the total can exceed what your digestive system currently tolerates. So we've been talking about this on and on. Imagine a breakfast made with 2 whole eggs, cooked in oil, cheese, avocado, and bacon. So you might look at that and say, oh, I wonder if I'm reacting to the eggs. Maybe I don't tolerate eggs, right? Or maybe it was the bacon. But even if you remove the bacon while keeping all the other sources of fat, that might not reduce the fat in the meal enough to make a very big difference. So a better approach might be to choose 1 or 2 sources of fat instead of 4. So you could have 1 whole egg with additional egg whites, use less oil in the pan, and choose either cheese or avocado. So that meal still feels like a breakfast. We've just made the total fat load more manageable. And this is often far more useful than placing eggs, cheese, avocado, and bacon on 4 separate lists of foods you believe you cannot eat. Now, can you still eat restaurant foods? Restaurant meals can be harder to predict because you do not control how much butter, oil, cream, or dressing is used. And in fact, usually you can't even see it. So you know that if you can't tolerate broccoli, you can see it on the plate, but you're not going to see these oils and fats very often or be sure what's in there or how much. So foods, even if they're described as grilled, roasted, or sauteed, they could still be prepared with considerably more fat than you would use at home, which is frustrating because we think of, okay, it's grilled chicken, it's going to be low in fat. But you don't have to stop eating out altogether. You may just do better choosing, making sure you're starting by choosing grilled or baked proteins. At a lot of places, you can say cook it without butter or oil. You can ask them, if you know that they finished their grilled chicken with butter, you can ask them not to. You can ask questions. You can request sauces and dressings on the side and ask for vegetables to be prepared differently with less butter or oil, or just no butter and oil. So it can also help to avoid combining a rich appetizer with an entree, with a side dish, all in one sitting. And I just want to add this in too, because people with digestive issues have the same prerogative as everyone else. Sometimes you may choose to eat a higher fat meal, knowing you will probably pay for it later because to you the meal is worth it. And that's not a failure. It doesn't mean you did anything wrong. The key here is understanding your patterns well enough that you can make that choice knowingly rather than being completely blindsided by the outcome and not knowing why it happened, right? And as far as nutrition labels can be helpful for comparing foods and spotting sources of fat that are easy to overlook, but don't feel like you need to obsessively track every gram of fat that you eat. I would pay particular attention to the serving size because a label may list a moderate amount of fat per serving, but the package may contain 2 to 3 servings. So cooking oils, nut butters, salad dressings, cheese, and snack foods are especially easy to pour, scoop, or eat in portions much larger than the amount listed. So use the label as information, not as a test you can pass or fail. We're trying to notice patterns like which meals are highest in fats, whether several fat sources are being stacked together, and whether a smaller portion changes your symptoms. And once you understand those patterns, the diet usually becomes much more flexible. You're no longer avoiding a growing list of foods because each one happened to appear before an episode of diarrhea. You're learning how much fat your digestive system can handle, how to distribute it, and which meals are most likely to cause symptoms. And that clarity allows you to manage your diet instead of becoming a prisoner to it. You can make adjustments when avoiding symptoms matters the most while still occasionally choosing to eat something you know may not agree with you because you decide it's just worth it. So let's talk about soluble fiber. I promised we'd come back to this. How can we use soluble fiber to help our bile acid diarrhea? Soluble fiber can help because it helps absorb water and it helps form a gel-like substance in the digestive tract. And this can help bind some of the excess bile acids that are reaching the colon and therefore slow the movement of stool and make bowel movements more formed and easier to control. And this is different from simply telling someone with diarrhea to eat more fiber. Some types of insoluble fiber add bulk and can speed food through the digestive tract, which makes urgency and diarrhea worse when symptoms are active. Soluble fiber tends to be gentler because it holds onto water rather than simply pushing more material through. So, useful sources of soluble fiber include oats and oat bran, barley, beans and lentils, apples and pears, bananas, citrus fruits, carrots, sweet potatoes, and psyllium husk. And the form here matters too, because a bowl of oatmeal, applesauce, or well-cooked carrots may be much easier to tolerate than a large amount of raw produce or bran cereal. And if beans or lentils leave you bloated, that does not mean soluble fiber itself is a problem. It may simply mean we need to use a different source or start with a much smaller portion. The biggest mistake is adding too much too quickly. Someone reads that fiber can help, starts eating larger servings of oats, beans, chia seeds, fruit, and vegetables all at once, and then wonders why they feel bloated and uncomfortable. More is not automatically better. I usually recommend adding one source at a time, beginning with a modest portion and increasing gradually as your digestive system adjusts. And psyllium can be a really useful option because it provides a concentrated source of soluble fiber, but it should be introduced slowly and taken with enough fluid. Your ideal amount will really depend on your current diet, your stool pattern, and how sensitive you are to changes in fiber. And our bile acid diarrhea diet guide does include practical sources of soluble fiber within a much more complete food list and shows you how to incorporate them into actual meals. We're not trying to pile lots of fiber on top of an already irritated digestive system. It's using the right type in the right amount to help make your symptoms more manageable. All right, this is a common question. So, should you follow a low FODMAP diet for bile acid diarrhea? Well, a low FODMAP diet is not automatically necessary for bile acid diarrhea. It may help if you also have IBS or difficulty tolerating certain fermentable carbohydrates, because as I talk about all the time, we very often have more than one thing going on, right? So you may have FODMAP intolerance alongside the bile acid diarrhea, but not necessarily. And the low FODMAP diet itself does not directly address the bile acids irritating the colon. In fact, when somebody tells me that they've been following a strict low FODMAP diet and they're still experiencing frequent urgent diarrhea with very little improvement, that's a major clue. It makes me ask whether FODMAPs are really the primary issue and think about whether bile acid diarrhea could be contributing. This is one of the patterns I pay very close attention to with my clients. And if bile acid diarrhea is contributing, we're talking about a completely different dietary approach. That person may be severely over restricting their diet by avoiding FODMAPs when what they actually need to pay attention to is the amount and distribution of fat. A strict low FODMAP diet, especially during its most restrictive phase, is also considerably more difficult to follow than a moderate fat diet. So it actually often means expansion of the diet even early on and a diet that's much easier. And of course, as I mentioned, two issues can overlap. So someone can have bile acid diarrhea and also notice that certain FODMAPs contribute to bloating, gas, abdominal pain, or looser stools. But that does not necessarily mean they need to follow the entire low FODMAP diet at its most restrictive level. I talk with people all the time who feel as though they need one diet for one digestive issue and another diet for something else. And before long, they're trying to follow several diets simultaneously and feel like there's almost nothing left to eat. And this is where working with a dietitian can make a huge difference. In our practice, we help clients determine which dietary changes are actually improving their symptoms and find their individual tolerance thresholds. And that might mean adjusting the amount and distribution of fat while making targeted changes to only the specific FODMAPs that cause problems for them. And what we don't want is to layer multiple restrictive diets on top of one another and follow every rule indefinitely. Instead, our goal is to create the least restrictive, most personalized approach that generally helps you feel better. Now, another question I often hear is, can a dietitian help with bile acid diarrhea? And yeah, we can. So, a dietitian who understands bile acid diarrhea and specializes in digestive health can help you manage symptoms without simply handing you a low-fat food list. And in our practice, we look at how much fat you're eating at one time, how it's distributed throughout the day, what does your soluble fiber intake look like? Are you meeting your nutritional needs? And what foods might you be avoiding unnecessarily? And we can also help you use more targeted strategies. For example, some people benefit from taking a small amount of psyllium, perhaps starting with a half teaspoon after meals to help bind bile acids and improve stool consistency. But these are not universal formulas. The amount, timing, and type of fiber need to be adjusted based on your symptoms, your medications, fluid intake, and how sensitive your digestive system is. And this is where deeper clinical experience can be very important. We pay attention to patterns such as whether symptoms are worse after a large restaurant meal, whether spreading fat more evenly changes your urgency, or whether diarrhea continues despite a strict low FODMAP diet. And we also look at overlapping digestive issues that might be affecting what you tolerate. Sometimes the most useful adjustment is not eliminating another food, it's understanding why the same food causes symptoms in one context but not another. Bile acid diarrhea does not occur always in isolation. Someone may also be dealing with IBS or SIBO or food intolerances or altered gut motility, dysbiosis, or trouble digesting and absorbing other nutrients. Maybe you've had a previous gallbladder removal or intestinal surgery or another underlying digestive condition. So we look at what else might be contributing because improving one part of the picture may not resolve every symptom. And that's where our functional approach at Nutrition Resolution comes in because we help clients calm the most disruptive symptoms while looking at how bile acid diarrhea fits into the broader digestive picture. We think about meal patterns, nutritional adequacy, overlapping symptoms, unnecessary food restrictions, microbial influences, inflammation, nutrient absorption, and digestive function. And we also order functional testing or tests that can be difficult accessing through a standard medical practitioner. And depending what's going on, that might include breath testing for bacterial overgrowth, stool microbiome analysis, organic acid testing, nutritional deficiency panels. The list goes on. And these functional tests give us useful information about digestive health and function even though they're not used to diagnose an overt disease and therefore are not typically part of standard medical care. So, if someone also needs further medical evaluation or conventional testing or prescription medication, we work with their medical team on that part of the picture. And then we put all of those findings together. So, maybe the bile acid diarrhea is part of what's happening, but there's also SIBO, altered gut bacteria, poor nutrient absorption, or another problem with digestive function. And we help you understand how those pieces may be affecting one another and what to do about them. And this is where personalization really comes in. We are not following several different protocols by the book or giving everyone with bile acid diarrhea the same plan. We're looking at your particular fingerprint and figuring out which dietary changes, functional strategies, and practical tools make the most sense for everything you've got going on. We're not trying to make you follow a perfect bile acid diarrhea diet forever. We want you to understand your individual patterns, have practical tools you can use in daily life, and make informed choices without becoming a prisoner to an increasingly restrictive diet. So, if there's one thing I hope you take away from today's episode, it is that bile acid diarrhea does not have to leave you afraid of food or following an increasingly restrictive diet. The problem may not be one specific food, it may be the amount of fat you're eating at one time, how that fat is distributed throughout the day, and whether you're getting the right amount or type of fiber. So start by paying attention to those patterns. Notice whether symptoms are worse after richer meals, restaurant meals, or meals that combine several sources of fat. Try reducing the total amount without eliminating fat completely, or spread it more evenly throughout the day and introduce soluble fiber gradually. And remember, you don't have to follow the diet perfectly. The point is to understand what your digestive system can comfortably handle so you can make informed choices without feeling completely blindsided by your symptoms. And if you want some practical help getting started, download our free bile acid diarrhea diet guide. It does include a complete food list, practical meal ideas, a 7-day meal plan, and a grocery list. And you will find it in the show notes. And if you've tried making these changes, but you're still struggling, or you suspect bile acid diarrhea is one part of a more complicated digestive picture, you can also apply to work with our team at Nutrition Resolution, and that link will be in the show notes as well. So, as always, thanks so much for listening. If you found this episode helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you would subscribe, leave a review, or share it with someone else who might be trying to make sense of urgent diarrhea after meals. Well, that's your gut check for this week. Come back next week for your next gut check.